Hey everyone, thanks for joining me for another episode of The Future of Work. My guest today is Michael Watkins. He's a leadership professor at IMD Business School, CEO coach, and he's the best-selling author of a book that I'm sure probably many of you have heard of, if not read, called The First 90 Days, Proven Strategies for Getting Up to Speed, Smarter and Faster. Or I should say faster and smarter. Michael, thank you for joining me.
Delighted to be here, Jake.
So I have many questions for you, but as is tradition on the show, why don't we get started with just background information about you? Even the days when you grew up, how did you get involved?
Yes, when I was a mere strip of a lad, Jake. That's where the story begins. So I'm kidding. So Canadian originally, from Ontario. Engineering. I call myself a recovering engineer. PhD, decision sciences, Harvard, on the faculty at Harvard for 13 years. Professor of international diplomacy initially, which I imported some ideas from diplomacy into the leadership work. I mean, maybe we can talk about that. And then at the Harvard Business School, and now at the IMD Business School in Switzerland, as you mentioned.
Wow, so quite a diverse background, getting your PhD as well. And then, did you, before you started your company and started doing CEO coaching, do you remember some of the full-time jobs that you had working for other people and what that was like?
Well, I always describe myself as being basically unemployable, Jake, right? I was a miserable minion, I have to tell you. I started working for a company. I worked like a real job for a total of about 3 years of my life, right? And they were the 3 most miserable years of my life because I was working for a very bureaucratic power utility, and I, sort of look forward to, currently at level 1, and if I kept at it for 10 years, I'd be at level 5, right? And I rebelled and ran away, basically. So no, I my sort of basis of credibility for talking about taking jobs does not flow from my own experience doing that.
Well,
although I should say, moving between business schools and moving continents, that there's certainly some of that happens too, for sure.
And my wife and I both describe ourselves as unemployable as well, so I totally get where you're coming from there. So it sounds like you had that same experience, right, that a lot of people have. I mean, you were level 1 and you were kind of in the day-to-day, the rat race, so to speak, trying to get to level 2, level 3, and it just wasn't for you.
It was not for me.
So obviously you wrote this book called The First 90 Days. And before we talk about some of the concepts from there, why did you decide to focus on the first 90 days?
So in terms of the first 90 days itself, the answer is basically it's a business quarter, which makes it a nice unit of time to be focusing on. It's not a week and it's not 6 months. It's something in between. It sounds good as a marketing, I'm kidding, as a marketing label. It's funny you ask this question, Jake, because people sometimes, say, he says transitions take 90 days. And of course, I never said that, right? How long a transition takes depends a lot on the transition. What I do focus on is using that first 90 days well. What I want you to do is make absolutely outstanding use of that time to get you as far as you possibly can. How far you get depends on a lot of different situations. But it's a good amount of time to talk about creating and implementing a plan, right, to get yourself up the learning curve, really start to become effective in a new role.
And to give people a little bit of context who are listening and watching, so first 90 days is basically, I mean, as you talk about in the book, there are different transitions that we go through. And so this is for people who get put into a leadership position. But one of the things I wanted to ask you is this also applicable for leaders who have been in leadership positions for a while, but they're having to learn, grow, adapt, and evolve? Can they still use that concept of 90 days of change?
So absolutely, and I do see some folks that basically use the first 90 days kind of on a rolling basis, right? So it's about your next 90 days, and you can kind of use it in that sense. I see leaders. I'm working with a CEO of a big U.S. healthcare company right now. They're going through a pretty big combination with another healthcare system. And so he's thinking in terms of, and we are working in terms of the next 90 days of that piece of work that he needs to do to bring those organizations together. So you can certainly apply it other places. If you're someone whose job responsibilities have expanded, but your title stays the same, or you've got a team taking on a new project, absolutely applicable.
Okay. And the book actually came out on Amazon. It says 2013, but did the book officially come out before 2013?
Yes. So the first edition of the book was published in 2003. And for the record, I was in my late teenage years at the time. That's a joke, of course. But no,
It's 16 years old he was when you published
I
this.
was just back to being a strip of a lad again. So yeah, so it came out at a time when virtually nothing had been written about transitions. The whole idea of onboarding people, no one was talking or thinking about it really, and so I just kind of caught a wave at that point, and it really took off. By the time we got to 2012, so much had changed that I had to, I changed about 40% of the book. And I'm actually just launching on writing the third edition right now because a lot of more things have changed since 2012. Not the least of what we're doing now, which is working virtually, right? As being a big one, global teams, very different. Agile methodologies. There's been so much that's changed in the almost 10 years since the last edition came out.
Yeah, that's actually what I wanted to ask you. So the first book has been out for almost 20 years, and this is before social media, before all these crazy technologies we have at our disposal. Even like you said, the 2013 one, it predates a lot of these tools and technologies, and COVID and Black Lives Matter, all the crazy stuff that has happened in the world. So you mentioned you're working on your third edition now. So can you give us a little bit of a sneak peek? What has changed in the first 90 days now versus 10 years ago?
Yeah. So speed, right? The rate of people transitioning, the expectations of them getting up to speed faster, it has been steadily, I think, growing. The number of job changes within an organization. So you've got teams that are pretty much constantly in flux. So and between that and global teams and remote work, the whole teams chapter is going to need a whole lot of work done to it, right? I mean, it's been interesting because, the book has been sort of one of those things that it just goes on selling, right? Because always there's new people coming into transitions, and sales haven't really dropped, right? It still sells, 100,000+ copies a year or something like that, which is pretty good. But it just felt like it was time, right? For those reasons that you note. Stakeholder management has changed. Transformation of organizations has changed, right? We've got a lot more. Feel like I've got a lot more to say about launching transformation efforts because so many leaders are being asked to do that now, right? There's very little steady state leadership anymore, right? Yeah. Every leader is a change leader. So the book has to be kind of updated to at least help you think about, are you going to launch some kind of substantial change? And if so, how do you at least get a good start, right, with it? So,
and a lot of people are actually going through a process of reinvention, even thinking if they want to continue full-time jobs. People are switching careers. And so I think a lot of the concepts that you talk about in the book can also be applicable just for any stage, even if you're thinking of going off on your own. I thought there was a lot of really great insight in there.
Thanks.
And one of the things that you talk about at the beginning of the book actually is this notion of a break-even point. And I thought maybe we could start there before we talk about some of these different transitions. So what is the break-even point that you talk about?
Well, so it's an analogy to financial break-even, right? If you think about what financial break-even is, you make an investment, how long does it take before it's paid itself back? Basically, that's the notion of the break-even point. And so I was just using a similar idea metaphorically, right, or as an analogy to thinking about getting up to speed. And the basic idea is, look, when you first take a new role, you're not creating value, right? You're probably consuming value in many circumstances, right? And then eventually you start creating value, and a little further along, you eventually reach the point where you're kind of at the zero value net creation. And that was the idea, right, behind it. And I think what's useful about that idea is not trying to quantify it, but more just thinking about how do we get to a point of true value creation in a role faster, right? That's faster and in better shape to continue to do well. So that's the basic idea behind it.
So at the point where you start giving as much value as you are taking from the company.
Exactly. So again, little jokes, right? I say it's the point at which you haven't done damage to your new organization anymore, right? So.
I like that. And how long do you think that usually takes? I mean, that's within the first 90 days, ideally?
Well, so no, well, yes and no. So we did some research, a few years ago about this, and admittedly, interview-based research, so it's got its limitations. But at the point of time, this is probably 5-6 years ago, people were saying unaided, it takes us about 6 months to reach that point.
Wow.
Yeah, and our more rigorous research has found you can basically reduce that by, pretty consistently about 50%, right?
Okay.
So there's huge value, right? I mean, gaining that amount of time and having that ability to have an impact on the organization faster is really valuable, especially if you think about all the transitions going on in an organization, right? So maybe we can talk about this later if you're interested, right? But there's both the leader perspective, but there's also what's the value to the organization of accelerating transitions.
Yeah. Well, actually, that's a good transition to what I wanted to ask you next, which is the different types of transitions. Then maybe we can talk about some of the common pitfalls.
Sure.
So what are some of the transitions that we might be experiencing? And maybe we don't even know we're experiencing, but it's still a transition.
Yeah, so I think this has been a really important focus of attention for me around research and writing, because I wrote the first 90 days as kind of the general purpose toolkit, Jake, for any transition, right? And then I did one of those things that only academics can do, is that, having said that all transitions are the same, I said, well, in reality, they're all really different, right? Now they're different in the sense that the principles and the tools hold up pretty well, but the way you apply them is different. The timeframes are different, right? And so I'll just give you a couple of quick examples. The difference between being hired from the outside versus being promoted inside. Think about coming in from the outside. The priorities typically are, of course, get up the learning curve with the job, but also integrate with the team, learn about the culture, understand how to navigate the stakeholder environment. Culture, politics are very big. Promoted to a new level, you may well know the organization very well already, have an established network. There, it's about how do you need to show up differently as a leader to be effective at that new and higher level, right? So I use that as just an example of a couple of different types of transitions, but there's many, right? But taking a role that didn't exist before versus taking a role that already did exist. Really different, because you've got to carve out what the role means. Sometimes people think that what you think your role is actually what their role is, right? So it's a big difference. Or leading people who are formerly your peers, right? Most leaders at some point in their careers have the experience of being promoted to lead people that were previously peers. That's got some unique features to it, right?
Yeah.
So it was kind of just really getting in and kind of cataloging the most common types of transitions, and then thinking about how do you apply the principles somewhat differently depending on what this is, right? And when you focus on learning, what are you focusing your learning about? Would be an example, right? When you're onboarding versus being promoted. And I guess the other thing that I found consistently, and I think folks find it really helpful, is you're probably going through multiple kinds of transitions at the same time. And so pulling that apart and just saying, okay, yeah, I've been promoted, but I'm also joining a new unit of the organization, and I just moved my family, and it's a new created role. And we're up to 4 or 5 kinds of transitions pretty quickly, right?
Yeah.
And so recognizing the sort of the complexity and disentangling it, pulling it apart, figuring out which parts are most challenging for you, there's a lot of value in doing that.
How many transitions would you say that maybe an employee, first job through their career? I mean, how many transitions are we talking about that somebody goes through? Is it, dozens, hundreds?
It's dozens for sure. Probably more in certain cases, because folks sometimes move pretty quickly between roles. It's a tricky question, okay, and I'll explain why in a sec, right? But I teach at a business school you mentioned, IMD Business School, and I run a big executive program there called Transition to Business Leadership, appropriately enough. And I survey people coming in and ask them how many transitions they've gone through, right? And the typical participant in the program has about 18 years of experience, and they've been through 15 major transitions.
Wow.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's not all promotions. It's joining new organizations. It's the counting is important, right? How you count and what you count is important, but the answer is a lot, right? And they're at a midpoint in their careers, maybe not even at a midpoint, given the way life expectancies and careers are going. So they've got a whole bunch more, right? I mean, I joke basically, you probably have at least that many more transitions before you buy your island in the, Aegean, Caribbean,
Yeah.
wherever you want it to be. Yeah. So I think the other thing that spins off your question that's important too is there's lots of what I call hidden transitions, where your role title doesn't change, your compensation doesn't change, but the nature of what you're doing can shift pretty substantially. And so those hidden transitions, if you can't start counting those, you're pretty rapidly up into pretty big numbers.
Does a transition also count if it's not something that you're doing, but something that affects you? So for example, if you get a new leader, so your leader moves out. Okay. So transitions can also be things that are in your environment, but they're not things that you are necessarily in control over doing yourself.
Absolutely, right? So if your organization is going through some kind of substantial change or transformation, and your role shifts, but your title doesn't, right? That's a big one. New boss, new team members, those are important transitions that impact you and your environment, right? For sure.
Yeah.
I sometimes, when I talk to groups about this, I sort of ask people, in the audience, back when we could do that. Boy, was that remember those days where audiences, yeah.
The good old days.
Yeah, the good old days. But I'd ask people, sort of how many of you are 6 months or less in your current job, and a third typically of people would put their hands up. And I said, I would also ask how many have a boss or a team member or a peer. And by the time I'd gone through that list, everyone had put up their hand at least one time, right? And so the point is, you're kind of living in this sea of transition. And if you're not actually in transition yourself, you're probably having somebody else's transition inflicted on you.
Yeah.
So, but I guess the other thing too, Jake, what's important is, sometimes there's real power in helping other people make successful transitions. I mean, if you've got a new boss, you've got to be careful, right? You don't want to be perceived as presumptuous or trying to curry favor, but there's much you can do to help people make successful transitions into new roles.
What are some of the common mistakes? I think in your book you talk about them as pitfalls. Some of the common transition pitfalls that people make.
Traps. So there's a few that I point to that I think are the big ones, right? And I think first one is sticking with what you know how to do and trying to impose that on the new role. And this is particularly important when you're being hired from the outside, and I'll explain why in a sec, right? But Marshall Goldsmith, you probably know that name.
Yeah, he's been a guest on the show too.
Yeah, terrific, right? And great work. He wrote a wonderful book called What Got You Here Won't Get You There. And that's a common trap. You see people that are sort of continuing to stay in their comfort zones, continuing to try and define the role through the lens of what they're good at. And so when I coach people, I'm one of the questions I ask them fairly early on is, what are you really good at and love doing that you need to do less of here? And what are you perhaps not so good at, or not so, enjoying doing that you need to do more of, right? So as you enter a new role, you need to think about, what do I need to let go of and what do I need to embrace? And that's kind of helps get you through the comfort zone trap, which is basically what we're talking about.
Yeah, I would imagine that's probably a big one because is that the most common one that people experience? Yeah. They just assume that everything that they've done in the past works.
Yeah, and it's most pernicious for folks that are coming in from the outside. Because often, you go through the hiring process and you get a view of what you are going to be doing, right? And it's romance, right? I've got my best suit on, you're looking great, this position's perfect for you to do. We want you to do exactly what you did at your last job, only more and better. But if recruiting is on like romance, employment is like marriage, right? You have to kind of really figure out what the actual mandate is here and what you're really there to do. And so, the antidote for that is to make sure you check and recheck what you're really there to do, right? How are you truly going to create value? And don't assume that people are going to welcome your ideas, right? Even if you have the answer, they're not necessarily going to say, oh yeah, gosh, we've been just waiting for you, right?
No.
Thank you. We've struggled for so long with these problems, and thank heavens you're here, No, right?
It's interesting because it also makes me think that you kind of need to read beyond the job description, because rarely does a job description, when you get hired, actually tell you the value that you're supposed to bring. It focuses on the specific actions of, like, you're going to be in sales, or you're going to be, responsible for creating marketing collateral.
Absolutely.
But I suppose you need to be good at really understanding what is the value for that. So I'm trying to think of, like, the best way to phrase that for people who are listening. I suppose maybe it's ask, like, do you have any questions that people should ask themselves? Is it really?
Yeah. But you just nailed it, right? You just nailed it. The number one question I tell people they need to keep asking them all the time is, how am I going to create value here? What am I going to do to create value here? What is my team going to do to create value here? How are we uniquely able to create value for the company through what we do? I mean, it's kind of like your North Star, right? And you just got to keep focusing on that question. And you need to ask people that question. It's not, there's no, I joke, there's no rocket science here, right? This is all distilled common sense, but still surprising how people don't necessarily do these things. But you nailed it completely.
So let's say you're a marketing leader, or maybe you're an HR leader. So I suppose the way that you think about, what am I doing to create value here? Would something like that be, I'm trying to make sure that the organization attracts and retain the best people? Would that be?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Right. So, I mean, I'm going to make this up, right? You use the example, right? But I mean, they're to make HR systems work well, because the basic transactional systems aren't working and serving the organization? Or am I there to be a strategic business partner to the leader around issues like talent and laying the foundation for future success, or some mix of those two? I just made that up, right? Totally, right? But being clear, first and foremost with your boss about what you're there fundamentally to do to create value is a great way, as you said, to keep yourself focused.
Okay. Yeah, I love that piece of advice. So go one level deeper beyond the job description to really understand why you're there.
Absolutely. And keep checking, right? Because sometimes people don't articulate it well the first time or second time. Also be aware that different people may have different key stakeholders, may have different views about that, right? And sometimes you've got to be balancing that a little bit. I mean, often the most important, of course, is your boss. But, if you're in a matrix organization, you may have two bosses, right? What do you do then?
So what are some of the other common traps? We talked about this concept of, what got you here won't get you there, the bringing in what you think you know.
Yep. So I'd point to a couple of others, right? One is not reaching out to your peers and other stakeholders early enough. There's a tendency even today in the network and matrix organizations we operate in, still to focus on your team and your boss to a degree, and not necessarily focus laterally into peers and stakeholders. And so just disciplining yourself to pay attention to those folks and reach out to them early, I think is a good thing to do, because you don't want to be going to them when you've got a problem, or you suddenly figure out, hey, I need God, I didn't know I needed Jake, right? And it's been 6 months and I've been blowing them off, for those lunch invitations. Yeah. So I think, thinking not just vertically, but laterally, really important. The other big one, and it's interesting, is the one I call the action imperative, right? And what I mean by the action imperative is the feeling you have that you need to take action. You need to do something, you need to make a decision, or, launch an initiative, or do something, right? And in my experience, yes, there may be external forces, like real parts of the role that are demanding that you do that, right? I coached a senior female healthcare executive who arrived 2 weeks before the strategic plan for her unit was due. And there was no negotiating whether it was going to happen or not, right? So she spent, 2 weeks working 24/7 to get that strat plan done, and have it be credible in the end. So sometimes you just have to do things, and you have to put in that kind of effort. But the pressure that you feel that you need to do something often is more internal than it is external. right? It's that sense, maybe it comes a little out of the imposter syndrome kind of idea, or that sense of, I need to show that they made the right decision in hiring me or promoting me, right? And you can have that pressure, and that can lead you to do things that you're perhaps not fully ready to do, or that are not as informed enough or not socialized enough. And that can create a vicious cycle if you're not careful. So watch out for, by all means, respond to the real pressures in a new role, right? The deliverables that you have to deliver. But if you start feeling like you've got to make these calls and doesn't seem to be any external reason why you're feeling that way, focus a little inwardly and ask yourself, what's the impetus for this, right? Where's the pressure from this coming from, right? And
self-awareness, it sounds like, is an important.
Absolutely, right?
Yeah.
Self-awareness and realizing that you may be, feeling pressure, to prove yourself, that could actually backfire in the end.
Yeah. No, those are some great traps. So one of the things I wanted to ask you, I found out this when I was working on my book. So I wrote a book called The Future Leader, which came out earlier this year. And thank you. So I interviewed 140 CEOs for that at a bunch of companies and surveyed 14,000 people. And one of the things that I was really, really shocked by is to find out at what age people actually start leadership development programs.
Mm-hmm.
And it was crazy to me that most people actually spend 10, 15, in some cases, even 20 years in positions of leadership before they actually get any leadership training. You could be in your 20s and you're assigned to be a supervisor. Maybe you're responsible for 1 or 2 or even 3 people in a retail store. Technically, you're a leader at that point of other people, but you don't actually get any leadership training until you're in your mid 30s or 40s. And that to me is just insane. Do you have any thoughts on that? Are you seeing this change? And how are you supposed to get up to speed in the first 90 days if your company doesn't teach you anything?
Yeah, no, it's such a good point, Jake. And I think, of course, there are companies that do better than that, right? Yeah. I do a lot of work with Johnson & Johnson, and they have a very strong frontline leader, development program that when you move into frontline leader positions, you're kind of eligible to go into. But I think they're probably the exception rather than the rule, right? And lots of companies have cut back on that kind of development, as I'm sure you've noticed, right?
Because it's nuts.
Yeah, it is. So what does it mean, right? It means that your people are not well equipped necessarily to lead. It means you don't have coherence in the way that you're trying to project a leadership model in an organization. It has issues for culture, almost certainly. But basically what it comes down to is it leaves responsibility for leadership development on the person, right? Okay, Jake, it's all on you, man, right? You got to go. You got to go out and figure out if you're, what it means to be a leader. So now the good news is there's a lot of resources out there these days, right? And so if you're understand this and are serious about it, you can put yourself on a learning path and get access to very cost-effective resources, right, that can help you learn a lot about leadership. But I don't think that's a really good way for organizations to be, operating. However, right, if you're dealing with a workforce that's turning over constantly, leaving the company, what are the incentives to invest in people, right? They're not really there, So there's a story behind this, which is I think kind of the unraveling of the social contract between workers and companies, right? And there's a lot of reasons why that's happened, but I totally agree with you that it has.
So can you talk a little bit more about unraveling of that social contract? Because I think, I've heard lots of people talk about this, and I totally agree. But for people not familiar with it, maybe you can expand on it a little bit.
Sure. So my father worked for a Crown Corporation in Canada, right? I'm from Canada originally. And, he worked his entire career with that company, and he worked his way up through the levels, and the company invested a great deal in him and his development. At the end of it, he attained an executive level, and he retired with a wonderful, defined benefit pension, right? and so there was a deal, right? There was a deal that you give us loyalty, we'll invest in you, we'll provide for you with a reasonable level of financial security. That's gone, right? I mean, it's gone. And the first thing, of course, that unraveled was the whole pension system with 401ks, and now we're for defined contribution and portable systems, and companies trying to minimize their pension obligations. So that incentive is gone. And then mobility just kind of took off, right? The war for talent, I think, contributed. I think, also there's almost certainly generational, attitudinal impacts to it. I mean, are you going to devote yourself and your life to a company, Jake? You ready to do that?
No.
We already talked about it. We already talked about our mutual unemployability, right?
Yeah, I made that decision like 15 years ago, but it's kind of even crazy today. Like, and I know this sounds bad to say, but it's like, why would you even want a full-time job for a company now? I mean, I know there are some good companies out there, but even the good companies, when things get tough and they don't meet their numbers, they turn on you. It's like having a pet that you love and that you think cares about you, and then one day it just bites you in the face.
Yep.
And
well, it's exactly right, and it goes back to the contract, right? What we would call a social contract. There's no willingness on the part of the company to make even short to medium term sacrifices to retain workforce and do stuff. I mean, I live in Europe, right? Mostly these days, just outside of Zurich. It's a completely different arrangement here, right? You still have a very strong social safety net. People spend on average much longer with companies here than they do in the US today. Yeah. Now, good, bad, I'm not going to get into politics, right, or philosophy here, but it's notable, right, that the notion that one would have some sense of loyalty to a company is very rare these days in the US.
So what do you do? Because a lot of people listening to this, I mean, they are employed, they have full-time jobs, but they're also very concerned for their own careers, right? I mean, everybody's kind of like, yeah, I work at this company, but do they really care about, everyone's got that sort of like looking behind your back when you're, so what do you do as an individual? Because you want to become a better leader. You want to teach yourself these things. You want to be a part of the company, but it's kind of like,
yeah, no, I mean, this is a question for the ages, right? I mean, it's the question of our age in some senses. I mean, what is the future of work? I have 3 children, right? 17, 19, 22. What advice do I give them about how to think about their careers, right? We know that a vast swaths of conventional jobs are going to be automated, right? And I am absolutely of the school that says there will not be close to enough new job generation to compensate for those job losses. Anything that involves a relatively narrow, body of knowledge or specialty is going to be automated eventually, right? We don't know exactly what the timeframes are, right? So, the remaining, eventually, right? The remaining roles are going to be integrative, creative, right? They're going to be the stuff that the machine learning can't do in the end, but there's going to be a lot fewer of people doing that stuff. So I know that wasn't exactly where you're taking us, Jake, but I do think about this, right? I try to think about, okay, what advice do I give to my children about how to think about your career? And the answer shouldn't be panic and find an island, right? Although sometimes I feel like that is the answer. I think continuous learning, flexibility, adaptability, resilience, emotional agility, right? Focusing more on the intersections between disciplines where you can create value in interesting ways. I mean, that's where, to me, the future of work is heading. I know that wasn't quite what you asked for, but
no, that makes sense. It just, the current business world, it just feels like there's more and more tension between employees and employers. And it just kind of makes me wonder, how much more can that tension build before something snaps and people are just like, the hell with it, I'm working for myself. Like, this sucks. So it's very, very interesting to see that. You bring up something interesting, which is, and you talk about this in the book, is relearning how to learn. And I feel like this is something a lot of people struggle with, because we always assume that what you learned in school will carry with you for years. And if you need to learn something, your company will teach you. But a lot of people are actually not good themselves at learning how to learn or relearning things. Can you talk about why that's so important? Do you have any advice on how to get better at that?
Well, there's a funny paradox, right? Which is sometimes the smartest people have the most difficulty learning, right? Because they're perfectionists, or, you know, they otherwise get blocked or afraid of, you know, making mistakes or whatever, right? You know, it's a cliche, right, to say you need to be a lifelong learner. It's also absolutely fundamentally, foundationally true if you're going to survive and thrive in what's coming for us, right? And I think what's coming for us is going to be very challenging and very turbulent. You know, and so, and we don't know yet fully, right, Jake, what the long-term structural impact on employment is going to be, right? What happens if 25% of the current workforce have their jobs disappear, right? What's that going to do to social stability? What about a sense of self-worth, right? Where does identity come from? For many people, it comes from what they do, right? I'm an educator. It's a core part of my identity. So I sometimes think we're setting ourselves up for the world's greatest identity crisis collectively, right? It's not a recipe for stability, you know, and we're seeing those forces already operating to some degree. Anyway, you're getting me philosophical, which we probably shouldn't do too much of.
No, these are interesting points. I mean, a lot of people, I get emails from people afterwards who always ask me these types of questions. So it's good to get perspectives from folks such as yourself who are involved with this. So I guess if we were to get back to this concept of the first 90 days, it seems like a lot of the accountability is not just on the organization to teach you what to do, but you need to kind of step up and be more of an active agent in what to do for the first 90 days. Intentional
and proactive is the way I describe it, Jake, and 100%, right? It's funny, I was in a conversation today with a senior HR leader at a large company that I won't name, right? And he was describing how his company is having difficulty retaining external hires who are, in quotes, different, right? Bring different skill sets, right? They're trying to seed new ideas, new culture into the organization by hiring from the outside. And then these folks show up and they get assassinated, basically, right? And he says it's really a puzzle because we have a good onboarding system, right? And so, but, you know, precisely to your point, right? Onboarding systems, even if they're good ones, treat people like objects, right? We will onboard you. There's a huge piece of this that is the responsibility of the leader to be intentional and proactive in onboarding themselves and integrating themselves into the new role, right? And so it's a combination of those things when it really works the best, right? When you've both got the organization focused on how do we, you know, welcome and integrate this person, and the leader very proactively and intentionally focusing on how am I going to create value? How am I going to connect? Yeah. Does that make sense? Am I answering your question?
Yeah, no, it makes complete sense. It's the responsibility of both parties, but you can't just. I mean, you need to be more active in your onboarding in the first 90 days.
If you don't own your transition will own you, right?
Yeah.
That's the way I sometimes describe it.
That's a good soundbite to put to it. So do you ever get pushback from leaders who say, you know what, why do I want to invest in leadership development and training? These people are not going to be here long enough. And what do you respond to people who say that?
Oh, wow. That's such a big question, right? I think you need to disaggregate things a little bit, right? Because I think, you know, the ROI on helping people make successful transitions is so high and so immediate that it's not really an issue, right? I mean, you know, the payback for doing this is virtually immediate, right? Because you typically are spending a lot of money hiring what's already high-priced talent, and you're paying recruiters to do it, and so a little bit more to help them get up to speed is kind of easy, right? So, but beyond that, when you get to leadership training and development and investment, absolutely, right? Because companies are making that very rational calculation saying, what is our return on that particular investment? How many of these people do we really retain in the end? Now, you know, and I think it's certainly true in companies in Europe where you still have a lot more loyalty and a lot more longevity. You still see lots of investment in leadership development. I'm seeing it, you know, being hollowed out in a lot of US-based companies for exactly these reasons. And partially COVID, of course, is contributing because, you know, it's a line item that's relatively easy in the short run to, you know.
Yeah, just mark it off the cost.
Yeah, exactly. So I think you've hit the basic idea here, though, right? Which is it only makes sense for companies to invest in developing people if those people are going to stay.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the other things I found in my research is that by 2030, I think there's going to be around roughly 220 million leaders in the world. So these are people who are responsible for the lives of others. So you got to imagine you have 220 million people floating around out there who don't have necessarily formal leadership development and training. And I think people also forget that leaders have a tremendous impact on what happens outside of work, not just at work. You know, like you can make someone's day or destroy their day or their week or their year as a leader.
Oh.
You know, it's not as if you treat somebody poorly and then when they go home everything's fine. I mean, you have a impact on people that's dramatic, that's beyond work, and also on society, on culture, and everything. And I feel like there's just not enough discussion on the influence that leaders really do have.
Yeah, I would pull those two things apart, Jake, because I think they're both important, right? The direct impact you have on the people who work for you. There's some really good research that was done a few years back by the Conference Board on employee engagement, which I'll send to you if you're interested, or maybe you've seen it, right? And you know, the number one factor in influencing employee engagement is the direct supervisor.
Yeah.
Duh, right? I mean, it's kind of a duh, right? But it makes complete sense because that's who's shaping your experience. It's who's shaping your environment. Yeah. And then I think the societal piece is it's just such an important question now because corporations are so powerful. And, you know, as I'm sure you know, there's real debate going on about the social role of business, right? And, you know, Milton Friedman and you know, corporations exist to create returns for shareholders school is locked in mortal combat with the wait a minute, businesses have a social role, and given the magnitude of the challenges they're facing, they should be exercising it, right? So we're seeing that kind of battle of titans going on right now. Yeah. I personally fall into camp number 2, right?
Yeah.
But you know, even so, when I work with CEOs, they struggle with how active in social issues should they become. So the CEO I mentioned to you, and why do they struggle? Because it reaches a point at which if they're seen as not spending their time well, or not realizing, you know, the value that they could be realizing, they can get themselves into trouble, right? Or if they do something to trigger a boycott of the company or something along those lines, it can create real issues, right? But at the same time, there's absolutely typically an area within which a very senior executive can have an impact on the social environment, right? And also the example of the CEO I'm working with, healthcare company, what's known as social determinants of health, right? How does your, you know, race, gender, you know, influence the quality of healthcare you get? That's an important question in the US, right? Not so much a question, by the way, in Europe as much, right? But it's a very big question in the US. And so he's working really hard, right, to focus some attention on that. Rural health as opposed to urban health is another great example, right? So he's having this huge impact through his focus on those things, right? Now he's doing it in a way that's not jeopardizing the core of the organization. It certainly helps from a perceptual point of view. You know, there's probably a virtuous cycle to a degree. But he, like most CEOs, has to be extremely thoughtful about how far to go, right?
Yeah, no, makes complete sense. Well, in the last few minutes, I wanted to talk maybe about 2 more things. One is, how do you know if you had a successful or a bad transition? Maybe any metrics or milestones to look out for and how to reach them. And maybe we can just wrap up with just some advice on how to have a successful transition. So first, milestones. I mean, how do you know it's a good transition or not? Do you literally measure day 1 to day 90? I mean, is it that strict?
No. Well, so that answer is no, right? So the joke answer is you're still employed, right, at the end of the time, right? Um, um, but I should say that there's lots of research that shows that senior executives who are hired from the outside, a large percentage of them fail, right? Now, they don't fail in the first 3 months or 6 months. It's often a year to 18 months before they finally depart, because it takes a while, for an organization to conclude they've made a mistake. It doesn't, my standing joke about internal promotions is they never fail, because people are so vested in the success of people often that even if they don't perform quite as well as they wanted to, they keep on going. That's not quite true. Again, that's a little hyperbole, yeah. So, to me, part of the success of doing this work is reducing the number of people, for example, that leave. Those regrettable losses that you have because you've hired people, but you've not really got them. It's in retention, right? It is a crucial variable for all this. And then to your narrower question about, when and how do you assess yourself? So in general, organizations do not do a good job of providing people with feedback about how they're doing early on. There's this tendency to go, oh, Jake, let's just give him some time. It's going to be okay. He'll be fine. He's just finding his feet. It'll be fine. And it's, I use the metaphor of the sailboat, kind of going off course, and the longer you go, the longer it takes to get back, if you get back at all, right? So one thing I've been working on is a 90-day assessment instrument, right, called a transition progress assessment. And basically, it's like a 360 sort of, right, in that it collects information from lots of stakeholders around you. But the focus is not on leadership per se, it's on how are you doing in transitioning and integrating into the role. And I'm getting quite a bit of interest in that idea, because of exactly what you're asking, right? Which is, how do we get more systematic about giving people feedback about how they're doing, right? So that they can take corrective action. It's surprising that, I run these things and people get the feedback and they're kind of like, I had no idea I was doing that, right? And they change as a result, right? But absent getting that structured feedback, they wouldn't have known to do that. And that's the point, right?
Is there anything that you can use for yourself as a measure of success? So like, if I'm going through a transition, how do I know it was successful or not? Because it seems like part internal and part like external feedback, but how do I know if it didn't go well or if it did go well?
Well, so I think you kind of, you're doing a great job of answering your own questions, Jake, which is a compliment, I have to say. So just so we're clear, right? Which is, one is that internal piece, right? Which is, are you energized by what's going on, right? And I look at energy levels very carefully in the people that I coach, right? Are you energized, right? And the second thing is, you ask the key stakeholders, how am I doing, right? You don't have to use a transition progress assessment or anything so structured. You get feedback, right? And you ask for and act on that feedback, and you ask for candid feedback, right? There's no other practical way to do it. I mean, well, I shouldn't say that. I mean, of course, your business results are also a piece of it, right? And so if you're really doing well with business results, that's important. If you're not, it's very important, So, but absent that, I think that internal check that you described and that external sort of touch base with people is both the best you can do and really important to do it.
Okay, great. And maybe last one or two questions to wrap up. So what advice do you have? Maybe we can start with new leaders who are in that transition process. What advice do you have for them to make that first 90 days as successful as possible? And then we can talk about more seasoned leaders.
Yeah. So understand the challenges, right? Be as clear as you possibly can about the challenges. Be clear as possible as you can about how you're going to create value and what you're there to do, right? Plan your learning process. Plan the process of engaging with key stakeholders early on. Be really thoughtful about how you're going to arrive in the new organization and what the messaging is that you want to send. Because a lot of what you do early on is about signaling and symbolism. So be really thoughtful about that, because those early actions can send very powerful messages, whether you intend them to or not. I mean, that would be some big ones. Be careful. I mean, back to the right? That pressure you can feel, the action imperative that I described. Be really thoughtful about the balance between learning and connecting and deciding and acting, right? Making sure you're trying to strike the right balance between those two things.
Yeah, no, I think those are important. And what about for more seasoned leaders who, it's not the first 90 days of a new role, but maybe they're going through their own transitions? Anything they should focus on or do?
So when you say they're going through their own transitions, how do you mean?
Well, I mean, maybe they're so they're not going through a new leader transition. They're going through some other kind of transition, or would the advice be the same?
It would be similar, right? I mean, the reason I'm hesitating is it depends a lot on the transition you're talking about, right? And so, I end up advising folks a lot on restructuring and reshaping their leadership teams, right? It's got similar ideas embedded in it, but you do it a little bit differently, right? Likewise, if you're sort of launching a big organizational transformation, there's a logic to how you set up to begin the process and launch it well. So that logic of getting off to a good start, right, sort of applies across a lot of things. But then it gets pretty, nuanced depending on exactly what you're doing. There are a couple, though, that I would point you to, and I know this is not what you were expecting, but I'm going to do it to you anyway. I have a colleague at IMD who runs a wonderful program for basically people that have kind of hit the plateau of their careers. And they're probably not going to go to the very pinnacle, but they've still got 10, 15 years of work life. And how do you kind of recharge yourself, revitalize yourself, think about that next era when you've sort of taken advancement out of the equation? That's a big transition. Retiring, right? Oh my God, it's hugely important, right? Now, you're a long way away from that. But I can tell you that people that have devoted their lives to running companies and strongly, kind of base their identities in doing that can go through like remarkably difficult times when they transition out into what life looks like beyond that, right? And actually some of the coaching I do is with people that are going through that. How do you sort of reimagine yourself, beyond the C-suite?
Yeah, those are all very, very important ones. And since we just have 1 or 2 minutes left, I had one more question I wanted to ask you, and that is, what happens if the transition does not go well? So the first 90 days do not go well. Can you rebound, or is it just game over for you?
Panic and run away screaming is my basic answer. No, so that's So I think there's a couple of different answers to that, Jake, and one is transitions take longer than 90 days, right? So if you haven't got where you want to, I say if it's day 91 and you haven't done everything you feel like you need to do, don't panic, right? The game is by no means over. I think recovery, your ability to recover depends on how much damage you've done, which then is a very important reason to get that feedback from like that transition progress assessment early, because there's no question you hit a threshold and it's over, right? Yeah. And I've occasionally been asked to do rescue missions with people, right? Executive who's got themselves into pretty deep trouble, can you help us get them out? And I hate that because it runs against everything I think about getting off to good starts. But sometimes because it's an important client, I end up doing that work. If it's gone beyond a certain point, right, where people have begun to see you through the gray cloud, right, and have formed these impressions that have hardened around you and are seeing every action that you take through the lens of those negative perceptions, it's pretty much over at that point.
Yeah, it's time to think of something else. Well, Michael, thank you so much for taking time to share your insights with me. Maybe you can let people know, where can they go to find you or your book, and when is the 3rd edition coming out?
So you can either find me through Genesis Advisors. So it's www.genesisadvisors.com, advisors with an ERS. You can link in with me because I manage my own LinkedIn connections and I always welcome outreach. You can reach me through the IMD Business School, www.imd.org. So those are probably the best places. The book, anywhere where you can get books, Amazon, your local bookstore, your local airport when we're actually flying places again.
When's the 3rd edition coming out?
So it's probably not going to be out until early 2022, believe it or not, just because of the publishing cycle. That seems impossibly far away at this point, but it actually in publishing terms is not. So
it takes time, man. It takes time. Well, I'm looking forward to it as well, and I definitely hope people check out your book as well. So, Michael, thank you for taking time out of your day to speak with me.
Delighted. Congratulations on your book too. I'm gonna check it out for sure.
Oh, thank you very much. Appreciate it. And thanks again for tuning in. Again, my guest has been Michael Watkins. Check out his book. I had a chance to read it. It's got thousands, that's right, thousands of reviews on Amazon. And it's called The First 90 Days, Proven Strategies for Getting Up to Speed Faster and Smarter. And I will see all of you next time. Michael, thanks again.
Pleasure.